You think you need a relationship. You think you need someone next to you, someone yours, someone close, someone to share life with. But if you stop and look honestly, more deeply, without the usual answers, it becomes clear that it's not exactly that. You don't just need a person. You need to be understood. Not superficially, not through words, not through explanations, but instantly, as if without translation. As if someone looks at you and doesn't ask, doesn't clarify, doesn't start analyzing, but simply feels what's inside you. So you don't need to choose words, don't need to explain why you react the way you do, why it's hard for you, why you stay silent, or, on the contrary, talk too much. You want to be seen as you are, without filters. And here is where the most important thing begins. Because if you're honest, you don't suffer that much from loneliness. You suffer from not being understood. You can be among people and feel completely alone. You can talk, laugh, spend time, but inside there's still this feeling that no one truly sees you. As if you are always slightly hidden, slightly out of place, slightly not yourself. And then the idea of relationships appears. It seems that if there is one special, close person, everything will change. They will understand, they will see, they will feel. And then it will become easier. Then there will be a feeling of home, calmness, acceptance. And you start looking not just for a person, but for someone who can close that feeling. But the problem is, you are not looking for a person. You are looking for a state of being understood, a state where you can simply be yourself without tension. A state where there is no need to constantly control yourself, filter yourself, adapt. And when you find someone who even slightly matches that feeling, you start holding on. Because it feels like this is it. Not because that person is perfect, but because next to them it becomes a bit easier to be yourself. A bit easier to breathe, a bit less tension inside. And you start attaching yourself not to the person, but to the feeling, to how you feel around them. And here the substitution happens. You think you love them, but in reality, you love the state that appears next to them. And that state becomes more important than the person themselves. You start ignoring things that don't suit you. You overlook moments where you feel uncomfortable. You justify behavior that hurts you, because you don't want to lose access to that feeling. And then relationships stop being a connection between two people and become an attempt to hold on to a state. And the more you hold on, the more you lose yourself. Because in order to preserve that feeling, you start adapting, changing, removing parts of yourself, smoothing out your edges. And gradually, you become more convenient, simpler, quieter, softer, but not real. Because the real you is not only convenience, it is complexity, contradictions, and moments where you are not perfect. But you are afraid to show that, because inside there is a fear. If I show myself fully, I will not be understood. I will be rejected. And then I will lose the state I've become attached to. And you start playing a role, not intentionally, not consciously, but gradually. A little silence here, a little agreement there, a little pretending everything is fine. And over time, you no longer notice where the real you ends and the adapted version begins. And the strange thing is, the other person does the same. They also adapt. They are also afraid of being misunderstood. They also play a role. And what you get is not two real people meeting, but two versions trying to fit each other. At first, it works, because both sides try, both maintain the image, both give each other what is expected. But this cannot last long, because real reactions eventually appear. Someone starts getting irritated, someone pulls away, someone stops investing. And then the question arises, what happened? Why did it change? Why did it get worse? But it's not that it got worse, it's that it became more honest. The game simply disappeared. The tension of maintaining the image is gone, and real habits, real reactions, real patterns start to appear. And this is where many people break, because the expectation was one thing and reality turns out to be different. And it feels like the person changed, that they are not the same anymore. But in reality, they just stopped pretending. And then disappointment appears, the feeling that everything was an illusion, that you were wrong, that you chose the wrong person. But if you look deeper, you weren't wrong. You just didn't see fully. And this is important, because if you think the problem is only in the other person, you don't see your part. You were also not fully real. You also created an image. You also held expectations. And then the cycle repeats. You look for someone who gives you that feeling again. You attach again. You adapt again. You lose yourself again, and you get disappointed again. And at some point, exhaustion appears. From people, from relationships, from trying. It feels easier to be alone, calmer, no expectations, no pain. But the truth is, you're not tired of people. You're tired of trying to be understood through others. Because you keep looking for it outside, in another person, in their reactions, in their words, in their attention. But the truth is, if you don't understand yourself, no one can do it for you. Because another person can only respond. They cannot feel for you. They cannot live your experience. They cannot fully enter your inner state. And even if someone comes close, it will never be a perfect match. Because you are a separate experience, unique, irreplaceable. And then the question changes. Not who will understand me, but do I understand myself? Because when you start understanding yourself, relationships become easier. You demand less, expect less, cling less. You stop seeking salvation in another person. You stop making them the source of your state. And then relationships are no longer a way to fill a void, but a way to share experience. Not an attempt to get something, but an opportunity to be riyadam, to be together. And there is a big difference here. Because when you are not looking to be saved, you start seeing the other person as they are, without projections, without expectations. And then real closeness appears. Not perfect, not without conflict, but alive. Because there are two real people in it. Not ideal, not always convenient, but honest. And maybe that is exactly what you are actually looking for. Not perfect understanding, but a space where you can be yourself and not run away from it. And if you look honestly, you realize everything starts not with the other person, but with you. With how willing you are to see yourself, to understand yourself. Not to run away from your inner states. Because as long as you don't do that, you will keep looking for someone who will do it for you. And that doesn't work. And at some point, you either continue the cycle or you stop and look inward. And this is not the easiest path. Because there are no ready answers there, no quick solutions, no feeling that everything will immediately become clear. But there is honesty. And it is this honesty that slowly changes everything. Because when you start understanding yourself, you stop demanding the impossible from others. And then relationships stop being an attempt to fill emptiness and become simply part of life. Not salvation, but an addition. And maybe only then you truly stop searching to be understood and start simply being there. Real. And there is something else that slowly becomes clear over time. Something you don't notice at first because it doesn't arrive as a thought. It arrives as a feeling. Very subtle, almost invisible. That even when you are understood, even when someone is close, even when things feel right, there are still moments when something inside you doesn't fully settle. A quiet restlessness, like something is still missing, but you cannot point to what exactly. And the first reaction is always the same. You try to explain it through the other person, through the relationship, through circumstances, through timing, through compatibility. You start searching for a reason outside because it feels easier than looking inward again. But the strange part is, the feeling often doesn't disappear when the situation changes. It follows, just in different forms, with different faces. And slowly, without dramatic realization, something becomes obvious. This feeling is not coming from the relationship. It is coming through the relationship. It is something that was already there before, just quieter, less visible, covered by movement, attention, novelty, distraction. And when things slow down, when the external stimulation fades, it rises again, not as a problem, but as something unprocessed, something unheld, something you never fully stayed with long enough to understand. And this is where the shift begins again. Not in changing people, not in improving communication, not in finding the right situation, but in learning to stay with what appears inside you without immediately turning it into a story about someone else. Because the mind is very fast at building stories. It always wants a cause, a reason, a direction, a target, something to fix. But inner experience doesn't always work like that. Sometimes it is just energy. Sometimes it is just tension. Sometimes it is just old emotion resurfacing without a clear name. And if you immediately attach it to a person, you turn something internal into something relational. And then you start solving the wrong problem. You try to fix connection instead of understanding experience. You try to fix closeness instead of understanding yourself. And this is how cycles repeat in a more subtle form, not as obvious mistakes, but as quiet misalignment, where on the surface everything seems reasonable. Communication improves, understanding improves, even care is present. But something still feels slightly off, not broken, just not fully integrated. And over time you begin to realize something that is not very comfortable at first. That emotional clarity is not something another person gives you. It is something you gradually develop the capacity to hold. To sit with confusion without immediately resolving it. To sit with discomfort without immediately externalizing it. To sit with contradiction without forcing it into one explanation. And this is not a natural state for most people, because the mind prefers closure, it prefers certainty, it prefers conclusions, even false ones. But real emotional maturity is often the ability to remain in the unfinished state without panic, without rushing, without turning it into action too quickly. And this changes the way relationships feel from the inside, because you stop entering them with the expectation that they will organize your inner world for you. They stop being a system of emotional regulation. They stop being a place where confusion must disappear. And instead they become something else. A shared space where two separate inner worlds exist side by side, sometimes aligned, sometimes not, but no longer merged into one illusion of perfect understanding. And strangely, this creates more stability, not because everything is solved, but because less is demanded from the connection itself. There is less pressure for it to carry your entire emotional reality. Less pressure for it to resolve what is actually internal. And when pressure decreases, something else becomes possible. Presence. Not perfect presence, not constant presence, but real moments where you are not trying to manage everything at once, where you are not constantly adjusting yourself to preserve an outcome, where you are not silently monitoring every reaction. And in those moments, something very simple appears, a kind of quiet honesty, not dramatic, not intense, just honest enough to be real. And real is often enough, more than enough, even if it is imperfect, even if it is unstable, even if it doesn't last in the same form. Because what you start to understand is that stability was never meant to come from another person alone. It was never meant to be outsourced completely. It is something that gradually forms when you stop abandoning yourself every time something inside becomes unclear. And this is a slow process, not a decision, not a breakthrough, not a sudden insight, but repeated moments of not running away from yourself. Even when it would be easier to distract yourself, even when it would be easier to interpret everything through someone else, even when it would be easier to turn complexity into blame or idealization. And with time, something changes in the background. Not your personality, not your desires, but your relationship to your own inner experience. It becomes less threatening, less urgent, less something that must immediately be solved. And when that happens, relationships also shift again. Not because they become perfect, but because they stop carrying the weight of your unresolved inner world. And then you begin to see people differently, not as answers, not as solutions, not as missing pieces, but as separate beings with their own complexity, their own uncertainty, their own internal movement that has nothing to do with fixing yours. And this reduces expectation, not hope, expectation. And there is a difference. Hope can exist without pressure. Expectation always carries pressure inside it. And when expectation softens, space appears. Space for misunderstanding, space for imperfection, space for pauses, space for not knowing. And surprisingly, that space is often where closeness becomes more real, not less. Because there is no longer a need to constantly maintain an ideal version of connection. And what remains is something quieter, less dramatic, but more grounded. Two people trying to meet each other as they are, not as they should be. And even if they fail at it sometimes, even if they misunderstand each other often, even if they drift and return, there is no collapse in it, because nothing unrealistic is being held anymore. And maybe that is the final shift. Not finding someone who understands you completely, but releasing the demand that such understanding must exist in a perfect form at all times, and allowing something simpler instead, being seen sometimes, being understood partially, being close without fusion, being separate without disappearance, and living in that balance, not perfectly, but honestly. And from there, everything else becomes less about solving a problem and more about experiencing what is already here, without needing it to become something else to be enough. And after all of this, there's still one layer that remains. Not because it is more important, but because it is harder to see. It is so close to your identity that you stop noticing it as something separate. the way you relate to yourself in silence. When there is no one around, no message coming, no conversation to continue, no external reflection of who you are, just you with your thoughts, your sensations, your internal movement. And in that space, something very subtle appears, a kind of pressure to define yourself, to decide what this moment means, what you are feeling, what you should do with it. As if even your inner life needs to be explained, packaged, understood immediately. And when that doesn't happen, discomfort appears, not dramatic, not obvious, but persistent, like something is slightly unresolved in the background. And most people don't recognize this as a separate process. They think it is just thinking, just reflection, just awareness. But sometimes it is not awareness. Sometimes it is resistance to not knowing. And that resistance creates constant movement inside, even when nothing external is happening, even when life is still, even when everything is technically fine. Because stillness outside does not automatically create stillness inside. And this is something people often misunderstand. They assume peace is the absence of external conflict, but a lot of internal tension exists completely independent of external conditions. It continues even in good situations, even in stable relationships, even in moments that should feel safe. And then you start wondering why you cannot fully arrive anywhere emotionally, why satisfaction feels temporary, why even good moments carry a slight shadow of questioning. And the answer is rarely external. It is usually the ongoing habit of turning experience into evaluation. Instead of allowing it to simply exist, you don't just feel something. You interpret it, you measure it, you compare it to what it should be. You place it against an internal standard you didn't consciously choose. And in that gap between experience and evaluation, tension is created. Not because something is wrong, but because something is constantly being judged while it is happening. And relationships amplify this process because there is more reflection, more reaction, more emotional significance, more meaning assigned to small shifts. So the inner system becomes even more active, more alert, more interpretive. And what you start calling connection issues are often just interpretation overload. Too much meaning assigned too quickly. Too much reading into signals that are not actually fixed signals. A pause becomes distance. A short reply becomes disinterest. A mood change becomes a threat. A silence becomes a message. And slowly, you are no longer in the relationship itself. You are in your interpretation of it. And this is where a lot of emotional exhaustion comes from. Not from what is actually happening, but from what is being constantly constructed on top of it. And at some point, something very simple becomes clear. You are not only relating to another person, you are relating to your interpretation system at the same time, always. And most of the tension is not between you and them. It is between you and your need to make everything immediately clear. And clarity is not always available in real time. Human behavior is not always immediately readable. Emotions are not always immediately understandable. Even your own emotions are not always immediately understandable. But the mind still tries, constantly, automatically, without asking. And this creates a kind of exhaustion that is hard to explain, because nothing big is happening, but everything feels slightly heavy, slightly over-processed, slightly too mentally active. And then you mistake that heaviness for a problem in the relationship itself, when in reality, it is often the speed of interpretation that creates the weight. Not the connection, but the processing of the connection. And slowly, you begin to notice that the most peaceful moments are not when everything is perfectly understood, but when less is being interpreted, when there is more space between experience and meaning, when you don't immediately turn every feeling into a conclusion, when you don't immediately turn every reaction into a story, when you allow things to remain slightly undefined for longer. And in that undefined space, something unusual happens. The intensity decreases, not because feelings disappear, but because pressure to resolve them disappears. And what remains is simpler, more direct, less mental, more lived. And this also changes how you see others, because you stop expecting them to provide instant clarity for your internal state. You stop expecting their behavior to always be readable in a stable way. You stop expecting consistency that humans cannot always maintain. And instead of trying to decode everything, you start allowing uncertainty to exist without immediate resolution. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped forcing clarity where it is not naturally present. And in relationships, this creates a very different atmosphere. Less tension in silence, less urgency in interpretation, less emotional escalation from small signals, more room for natural fluctuation, more room for misunderstandings that do not immediately become crises, more room for being imperfect without it meaning something deeper every time. And over time, something softens, not the depth of feeling, but the pressure around it. And in that softer space, you begin to notice something else. That closeness does not require constant understanding. It requires enough stability not to collapse in uncertainty, enough trust not to immediately interpret every unknown as danger, enough inner grounding not to turn every gap into a story. And that grounding does not come from another person. It comes from repeated experience of staying with yourself without rushing away from discomfort, without turning it into explanation too quickly, without turning it into blame too quickly, without turning it into meaning too quickly, just letting it be there long enough to lose its sharpness. And slowly, this changes the entire structure of how you relate, not in a dramatic way, but in a cumulative way, moment by moment, interaction by interaction, silence by silence. Until one day you realize that you are no longer trying to solve every emotional movement immediately. You are no longer trying to stabilize every uncertainty instantly. You are no longer trying to turn every experience into something fixed. And there is more space inside. Not empty space, but livable space, where things can exist without immediate definition, where you can exist without immediate explanation, where others can exist without immediate interpretation. And in that space, relationships become less like problems to manage and more like experiences that unfold. Not perfectly, not permanently, but genuinely. And that might be the quiet shift underneath everything else. Not finding absolute understanding, but learning to stop turning the absence of it into tension. And at some point, something shifts again. But this time, it is not about other people. It is about how you relate to the idea of control itself. Because control is not just behavior, it is a feeling, a background tension that says, if I understand enough, I will be safe. If I predict enough, nothing will hurt me. If I analyze enough, nothing will surprise me. And slowly you start to see that this doesn't only exist in relationships, it exists in everything. In how you think about the future, in how you replay the past, in how you interpret even neutral moments. There is always a subtle attempt to stay ahead of reality, to arrive before it happens, to already know what it means before it unfolds. And the strange thing is, it feels like responsibility. It feels like maturity. It feels like awareness. But underneath, it is often just fear wearing a very intelligent mask. Because being present without interpretation feels risky. Not because something is wrong with the present moment, but because the mind is not in control of it. And this is where a deeper conflict appears, not between you and other people, not even between you and your emotions, but between you and reality as it is unfolding. Because reality does not wait. It does not pause to be understood first. It does not slow down until you are ready. It simply continues. And if you are always trying to understand it faster than it arrives, you are always slightly behind it, always slightly tense, always slightly catching up. And that catching up becomes your normal state without you noticing. You think this is just how thinking works, but it is actually a constant attempt to reduce uncertainty. And uncertainty is the thing the mind struggles with most, because uncertainty does not offer structure. It does not offer closure. It does not offer control. It only offers experience. An experience without control feels too open at first, almost unprotected, like something is missing. But what is missing is not safety, it is prediction. And prediction is what creates the illusion of safety, not actual safety, just the feeling of knowing what comes next. But life is not built to stay predictable for long, and people are not built to stay predictable either. Even you are not. So the system keeps failing in small ways, and each failure creates a need to try harder, to think more, to analyze deeper, to adjust better. And this loop can continue for years without being noticed, because externally everything still works. You still function, you still communicate, you still maintain relationships, you still make decisions. But internally, there is a constant background effort, like holding something in place that never actually stabilizes. And what makes it even harder to see is that sometimes control does help. It reduces immediate discomfort. It gives short-term clarity. It prevents impulsive mistakes. So the mind learns, this is useful, this is necessary, this is who I am. But it never asks the deeper question, at what cost? Because the cost is not immediate. It accumulates in subtle ways, in tiredness that has no clear cause, in emotional distance that feels normal, in difficulty fully relaxing even in safe moments. And especially in relationships, this becomes invisible complexity. Because you are not just experiencing the relationship, you are managing it internally at the same time, continuously adjusting, continuously scanning, continuously updating internal meaning. And the other person is also doing something similar, maybe in a different way, maybe less consciously, but still present. So what exists between two people is not just connection. It is two interpretation systems interacting, two prediction systems trying to stabilize something that is inherently fluid. And sometimes it aligns, and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes it almost does. And that almost creates more tension than clear distance would. Because almost understanding feels like it should be closeness, but it still contains uncertainty. And the mind struggles most with near certainty that is not complete certainty. That is where overthinking intensifies. That is where meaning becomes overbuilt. That is where small things start carrying large emotional weight. Not because they are large, but because they are unresolved. And over time, something very quiet becomes visible. You are not reacting only to what is happening. You are reacting to what your mind is trying to prevent from happening. And most of the time, what it is trying to prevent is not actual danger. It is emotional discomfort, uncertainty, loss of control over interpretation. And when you see that clearly, something starts to loosen. Not instantly, not dramatically, but enough to notice a gap between event and reaction. A space where you don't immediately have to define everything. A space where meaning can arrive later or not at all. A space where silence is just silence again. And in that space, something very unfamiliar appears. Not certainty, not understanding, but relief. Because for the first time, not knowing does not immediately require fixing. And that changes how you are in relationships more than anything else. Because you stop entering them as systems that must be understood in real time. You stop treating every moment as information to decode. You stop turning every emotional fluctuation into a signal. And instead, you start allowing things to be partially unknown without collapsing into interpretation. And that is not detachment. It is not indifference. It is a different kind of participation, less control-based, more presence-based. And presence is not passive. It is actually more demanding in a different way, because it requires you not to escape into explanation too quickly, not to escape into certainty too quickly, not to escape into narrative too quickly. Just to stay with what is happening before it becomes a story. And this is where something very simple but very deep becomes visible. Most suffering is not in the experience itself. It is in the immediate story built around it. And the speed of that story determines a lot. How intense things feel, how personal things feel, how permanent things feel. And slowing that speed even slightly changes the entire emotional landscape. Not by removing emotion, but by reducing unnecessary amplification. And when amplification reduces, something else becomes possible. A more honest contact with what is actually here. Not what it means, not what it predicts, just what it is. And in that simplicity, relationships stop being puzzles. They stop being constant interpretation challenges. They stop being emotional systems you must continuously decode. And they start becoming something closer to experience again. Something that unfolds without needing to be fully understood at every step. And maybe that is the quiet direction everything has been moving toward all along. Not perfect understanding, but reduced urgency to understand everything immediately. And from there, something more human becomes possible. Not control, not certainty, but contact. Real, imperfect, momentary contact. And there is another layer that becomes visible when this need for constant understanding starts to soften. It is the layer of identity itself. Because most of the time, you are not just experiencing life. You are maintaining a version of yourself while experiencing it. A continuous, silent effort to stay consistent, to stay recognizable to yourself, to not contradict what you believe you are. And without noticing, this becomes another form of control. Not control over others, not even control over events, but control over your own internal narrative. You start protecting the idea of me, what I usually think, how I usually react, what I am like in relationships, what I am like alone, what I am like when I'm calm, what I am like when I'm not. And slowly, this creates a subtle pressure, because reality does not stay consistent enough to fully match any identity. It keeps shifting, sometimes slightly, sometimes completely, but never perfectly aligned with a fixed version of you. And every time there is a mismatch, something has to adjust. Either your interpretation of yourself or your interpretation of the moment. And most people unconsciously choose the second one. They adjust reality to fit identity, instead of adjusting identity to fit reality. Because adjusting identity feels like losing stability, like becoming less defined, less certain, less real in a way that the mind understands. But what actually happens is something else. Identity becomes tighter than necessary, more rigid than experience requires. And this rigidity creates quiet tension, not always visible, but always present in the background. You feel it in the way you explain yourself, in the way you justify reactions, in the way you try to stay consistent across time, as if inconsistency would mean something is wrong. But inconsistency is not a problem of identity. It is a property of being alive. You are not one fixed emotional state. You are not one stable reaction pattern. You are not one clean narrative. You are movement, context, change, response. And the more you try to compress that into a single understandable line, the more pressure you create internally. Because something inside always knows, this is not all of me. And relationships intensify this again, because in relationships, identity becomes visible. It gets reflected back. It gets challenged. It gets misunderstood. It gets simplified by others. And that simplification often feels uncomfortable. Not because it is wrong, but because it is incomplete. Someone sees you as more emotional than you feel, or more distant than you feel, or more confident than you feel, or more uncertain than you actually are. And in response, you start correcting, explaining, rebalancing, trying to restore the correct version of yourself in their perception. But in doing so, you slowly move away from direct experience again, back into management of perception, back into shaping how you are seen, back into maintaining coherence. And coherence becomes more important than honesty. Without you consciously choosing it, it just happens. And over time, something subtle forms, a version of you that is optimized to be understandable, not necessarily true in every moment, but stable enough to be accepted. And this version becomes socially useful. It reduces conflict. It reduces misunderstanding. It reduces friction. But it also reduces depth. Because depth requires contradiction. And contradiction is exactly what this version tries to remove. So you start living slightly flattened. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that you can feel it internally as a kind of narrowing. A sense that some parts of you are not fully expressed unless conditions are perfect, unless you're alone, unless you feel completely safe, unless there is no risk of being misunderstood. And so, your expression becomes conditional. Not fully free, not fully spontaneous, but filtered through context. And this filtering becomes so automatic that it starts to feel like personality. Like, this is just how I am with people. But often it is not personality. It is adaptation that became identity. And the moment you start noticing this, something strange happens. You realize that there are multiple versions of you that are all real, but none of them are complete. Each one is context-bound. Each one is partial. Each one is valid, but not total. And this realization can be unsettling at first, because it removes the idea of a single, stable core that explains everything. But at the same time, it creates space, because if there is no single, fixed version, there is also less pressure to defend one. And in relationships, this becomes very important, because instead of trying to be consistently understood, you begin to allow yourself to be inconsistently seen. Not perfectly, not fully, but honestly in the moment. Sometimes open, sometimes closed, sometimes clear, sometimes unclear, sometimes warm, sometimes distant. And without immediately turning these shifts into meaning, without making them who I am, just seeing them as states, passing states, not definitions. And this reduces the emotional weight of interaction, because everything no longer has to mean something permanent about you. Everything no longer has to be interpreted as identity evidence. A bad moment is just a moment. A misunderstanding is just a misunderstanding. A silence is just silence. Not a conclusion, not a verdict, not a definition. And when this begins to settle, something else becomes noticeable. You start to feel less pressure to perform yourself correctly in real time. Less need to be internally consistent at every second. Less need to make sure every reaction fits the narrative. And that space creates something very subtle but very important. Ease. Not happiness, not excitement, just ease. A reduction of internal friction. And from that ease, something else becomes possible in relationships. You stop treating every interaction as a reflection test. You stop asking constantly, how am I coming across? You stop adjusting every sentence for emotional safety. And you start participating instead of managing. And participation is different. It is not controlled from above. It is not edited in real time. It is simply lived. And when you live interactions instead of managing them, something paradoxical happens. You become more understandable without trying to be. Because there's less interference between what is happening and what is being expressed. Less internal translation, less editing, less correction. And what remains is more direct, more human, more readable in a natural way. Not because you are simpler, but because you are less filtered. And this is where a deeper shift begins to appear in relationships again. You start to notice that closeness is not created by explaining yourself perfectly. It is created by not interrupting yourself too much while being present. And that misunderstanding is not always a failure. Sometimes it is just the natural distance between two internal worlds. A distance that cannot be fully removed, only navigated. And when you stop treating that distance as a problem to solve, something softens again. Expectations drop, tension drops, urgency drops. And what remains is something more stable in a quiet way. Not perfect understanding, but enough continuity to stay connected without constant strain. And that enough becomes more important than perfect, because perfect was never actually achievable, only imagined. And slowly, the need for absolute emotional clarity starts to lose its dominance. Not because clarity is unimportant, but because you stop demanding it instantly from every moment. And in that space, life becomes less like a problem to decode and more like something that is happening while you are inside it, not outside trying to understand it first, but inside it while it unfolds. And that shift, even if it sounds subtle, changes almost everything underneath how you relate to yourself, to others, to uncertainty, to closeness, to silence. And for the first time, not knowing does not feel like failure. It feels like part of being here.